I'm Kylie Cheung. I'm the author of Survivor Injustice, State-Sanctioned Abuse, Domestic Violence, and the Fight for Bodily Autonomy, and the forthcoming book, Coercion, Surviving and Resisting Abortion Bans. And I'm also a politics writer at Jezebel. I'm so excited to be chairing this panel today with our brilliant speakers, who I'll now introduce. Speaking in this order, we have Melissa Gira Grant, a staff writer at the New Republic and the author of Playing the Whore, The Work of Sex Work; Soraya Chemaly, author of Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger; and Alia, Alia Dastagir, author of To Those Who Have Confused You to Be a Person, Words as Violence and Stories of Women's Resistance Online. They'll each talk about their work, and then I'll ask a couple questions to the panel and then open this to the audience for your questions. But yeah, we'll start with you, Melissa.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be doing this. I have no idea how you're reacting, so I'm going to ask you a question, not knowing if you can actually react to this, but let me take you back. Do you remember about 2 months ago in Idaho, a woman was dragged out of a town hall meeting the Republicans had held? And it was just 2 months ago. It feels like a million years ago, to be honest. But when I was sort of thinking of the clash between resistance and male supremacism, this just felt like a good moment to jump off from. Her name was Teresa Lauren Paul, and she did not know when it was happening, she said, if it was an arrest or a kidnapping. The men that had grabbed her weren't wearing any insignia, anything that identified them. This was a town hall event in like a public space. It was completely packed with people. And, it's a scene that we have seen play out many times over the last few months when opponents of Trump and Elon Musk have come to a town hall to tell their lawmakers to show some spine, even in these very deeply conservative counties, like Kootenai County in Idaho, in the town of Coeur d'Alene. So when this group of unmarked security descended on this woman, the conflict in the town hall that was already sort of raging between the residents and the speakers escalated dramatically in a way that was very surprising. What happened was a member of the panel who was saying some anti-abortion talking point that isn't worth dignifying. A woman from the audience talked over him and interrupted him and just said in a very flat way, "Women are dying." And the panelists kept going, but then the moderator interrupted and lectured the audience members, who he said were popping off with stupid remarks, at which point this woman yelled back at him, "Is this a town hall or a lecture?" And he yelled back at her, "You're just crazy." And at this point, she noticed that the sheriff, Robert Norris, was standing over her, and he was in plain clothes. She didn't recognize him at first. And the moderator at that point screamed, "Get him out." And at that point, Sheriff Norris leaned in as she was still seated and told her, "Get up or be arrested." All that she has done is just yell out of turn, "Women are dying." And in a meeting where like lots of people were yelling out of turn, but for whatever reason, she became the target. A woman who was sitting next to her pulled out her phone, as is like a reflex at this point, and the sheriff said she'd be removed also. And then also around the sheriff were these like men that, again, they were unfamiliar to her. They didn't seem to be cops, but they didn't have any like, they seemed like official. They had like earpieces on and sort of like camo, like pseudo tactical gear on. She didn't leave. She stayed in her seat. The moderator kept taunting her. The little girl's afraid to leave. She spoke up, and now she doesn't want to suffer the consequences. And at this point, a man in a black jacket and olive pants and with an earpiece stepped into the row, physically grabbed her by the wrist. She yanked it back. He grabbed her hand again. He's looming over her, yelling at her. She's yelling back, "This man is assaulting me." And then he pulls her into the aisle, and she yells, "Who the fuck are these men?" Which I think is a very good question. These men get very physical with her. They zip tie her. They start dragging her down the aisle, or up the aisle into the kind of like lobby outside the auditorium. She's on her stomach. They're kneeling over her. Everyone is screaming. People are applauding all of this happening. So who were these men? Who were these men who accosted Teresa Lauren Paul? And what was the local sheriff doing there? what is happening when like this is an escalation that happens at a town hall event like that. So, you know, the internet is full of sleuths. It didn't take very long once these videos of this event were circulating for people to like get the whole story on who these guys were. They style themselves as a private security firm called Lear Asset Management, but they really seem more like a weekend warrior militia who've popped up in various spaces in the West. They've been in California, they've been in Idaho. And it seems like they aren't even always identified, but they show up and like, or they aren't always invited, but they show up and they offer like security. There was a weird profile about them in Time magazine that described them like a military assault force clad in body armor and camouflage, carrying AR-15 rifles. They've policed illicit marijuana farms in Mendocino County. Who knows what they were doing in Idaho at this point? So when these guys, again, without identification, tried to remove Teresa Barnpole from this town hall, the videos turned it into a huge story. You know, a white woman, nice blowout, jeans. She's being manhandled by these guys, pulling her from her seat, dragging her through the auditorium. At one point, as they dragged her away, they exposed her bra and just left her there. They called her crazy. They mocked her as a little girl who got what was coming to her. And, you know, it's almost like a parody of like what this sort of encounter would look like. Oh, this crazy woman, we're going to punish her in front of the whole town. Like, and the people who are doing it are this apparent self-styled militia group. And in this case, they're doing it at a Republican Party event. This like kind of bizarre collision between like this militia group and like the actual, you know, people who run the government. For all intents and purposes, what this looks like as you watch it go down is retaliation for speaking out, right? It's public punishment. It's sexualized. It's misogynistic. And all that she did was speak out when men were lying to her. And to a lot of people who watched this, people who weren't there, and not just women, it seemed like a threat. It seemed like a way of saying this could happen to anyone who speaks back. Um, this group, of course, this was not like the first time they retaliated against activists. They did not go after this white woman first. They have a history of targeting activists, including environmental justice activists in Northern California. They terrorized a native Hawaiian activist who was involved in like defending a public forest that was going to be logged, and, you know, drove up to her while she was standing at the entrance in like a black pickup truck with masks over their faces. They refused to identify themselves, but her lawyer figured out who they were after. And he said they just came up to her. They said, you need to leave. And when she said that she wouldn't leave, they responded by reaching into their pockets and throwing bullet casings in her face and saying, it's dangerous here. I think any reasonable person would think that was a death threat, her lawyer said. And one of the men in the truck, his like mask was a Blue Lives Matter mask. So the place where this also all went down is significant. This is Kootenai County, the town of Coeur d'Alene. This is a place where the local Republican Party has been dominated by MAGA Republicans, and multiple militia and militia-like groups have been active there. You know, going back to the 1990s, this was a part of the country where the Aryan nations tried to build a base for themselves before being run out of town, essentially. But in the last few years, there's been sort of, you know, the heirs of those groups have arrived and, you know, made themselves known, including somebody who was at Unite the Right in Charlottesville in 2017, who ran for city school board, got an endorsement from the Kootenai County Republican Party, who threw that rally or that town hall meeting. He lost. And then last year, a sheriff in Kootenai County went viral when he went hunting for explicit books in a local library with his body cam on. So you could see him going around and like narrating books that he thought children shouldn't have access to. And then, of course, you know, Coeur d'Alene was the site of this mass arrest, maybe the largest mass arrest of a far-right group. The group Patriot Front had 31 members arrested in the summer of 2022 in their signature khakis, also with their faces covered. They were pulled out of a U-Haul, which is sort of their preferred mode of transportation. They were on their way to a pride event to disrupt it and were spotted. So when I saw the videos from the town hall in Coeur d'Alene, I thought of those videos of the Patriot Front arrests. You know, those guys in those videos seemed very pathetic and defeated. it felt like a moment where maybe these guys are on the back foot. They hadn't even instigated the harassment of the Pride event. They just latched on to another local group who had declared war on the event. And this mass harass, this moment when it felt like maybe the right is on the back foot, was in 2022. Biden's in office. It really, though, was the beginning of the attack, the all-out attack that we're seeing on queer and trans people. And at a time, it felt like people weren't really wanting to pay attention to it because it seemed like we were all just wanting to relax into this post-Trump era. But if you lived in a Western state, if you lived in a Southern state, your legislature, your governor, and attorneys general are carrying out an all-out war on queer and trans people. Hundreds and hundreds of new laws to criminalize their communities, even people who support them, people who throw pride events. And the far right, would also help fuel this moral panic that painted queer and trans adults as groomers who were preying on children. This group in Idaho who latched onto this, the Panhandle Patriots, they said that they were going to protest Pride to go head to head with these people. Their insignia had like an AR-15 style rifle on it. They had been at January 6th. Like, people actually took their threat pretty seriously. But then when the Patriot Front guys got arrested, it kind of nothing ended up really happening. And it seemed to people like maybe we actually, scared these guys out of town. So yeah, all these groups, we have the Panhandle Patriot guys, we've got this militia group, Lear, we've got Patriot Front, the Republican Party, for all intents and purposes, they are working from the same playbook. They see it as their right to police women and queer and trans people. They see themselves as all that stands between civilization, by which they mean white, male, Western civilization, and chaos, or what we might call freedom. And in Idaho, they found allies, not just in the county Republican Party, but at the state level. And now men who share that playbook are in the White House. And we are living through what the extreme researcher Jan Berger has defined as lawful extremism. We are in a moment where one tool that can be used against an outgroup, the kind of harassment and abuse that has been escalating against queer and trans communities, carried out primarily by extremist groups, now state laws and executive orders are being wielded much to the same end. So what we saw earlier this year at that town hall, that didn't begin right when Trump came back to the White House. That is an event that has this longer trajectory within Coeur d'Alene specifically. And likewise, the resistance that we see, the resistance that this woman expressed to Trump, to lawful extremism, that is not limited to Trump himself. It has by necessity had to be directed at multiple targets, pushing back on multiple fronts at the same time. And that resistance doesn't look like what it seemed like some in the media thought the resistance should look like. So, after the election, there's all these stories about, oh, everyone's exhausted and they're going to sit this one out. And, I guess because the National Mall wasn't packed with pink pussy hats, that meant that everyone had moved on and we're just going to acquiesce. Maybe some people did. Maybe people for whom 2017 was their first real act of political resistance, or truly burned out and didn't see the point. It is exhausting, but the story that those protests in 2017 were trying to tell, this man who has sexually assaulted women, who is now in the White House, and himself as a threat to democracy, that story has also only gotten more grim, more all-encompassing, and more overwhelming in the last 8 years. And if anything, there's too much to protest, and there are too many villains, and just an overwhelming multiplying number of stories competing for our attention and for reaction. And some of this is, the administration's responsibility. Their flood the zone tactics meant to just overwhelm us with more than we could possibly keep up with. But that also hasn't stopped anyone. The Tesla takedown protests, for example, there's different ways that they go after Elon Musk. He can be an unaccountable oligarch. He can be a Trump toady. He can be a guy who's polluting space. He can be an absent father who's weirdly obsessed with birth rates. He's the Doge, whatever his role is at Doge. the town halls themselves, which started as protests against Doge, now they've sort of transformed into vehicles for pushing back on mass deportation and Trump's attempts to disappear immigrants. And in some cases, these protests are only really incidentally about Trump. So one of the very first protests that I went to was around Trump's executive orders affecting trans kids. And, you know, it got me thinking, the people who sort of organized some of these first protests are the people who never stopped protesting because these communities have been under attack this entire time. And the things that were turning people out in the streets, in addition to those executive orders targeting trans kids, were those early ICE raids where people whose own communities were raided were the people coming out in the streets. Many of these are protesters who, had remained active no matter who was in the White House and still had sort of a base to turn out. Their communities did not see the Biden years as a victory or as a reprieve. The reprieve never came. Biden also deported many people. He didn't brand them the same way that Trump did. He didn't make the media spectacles. But as far as we know, Trump is on track to have deported as many people in his first term as Biden ended up deporting. For trans people whose states are attacking them, Biden may have mentioned in some speeches that he supported them, but that work then was like all undone essentially within 2 weeks of Trump, or attempted to be undone. And to then sort of look and be like, oh, the protesters are tired. And it's like, well, of course they're tired. Like, the communities who are most targeted are always targeted. It's not just Trump who's been targeting them. And in a way, what's going on is making things even worse. These are people who've been on the front lines fighting the far right and other extremist groups. Of course, like, those are the people who are going to turn out first, but they don't look like the resistance. And so there was a lot of like dismissal. So that first protest that I went to right after the inauguration, it was at NYU Langone, a hospital that had been offering gender affirming care. And as far as we knew at that time, had of their own volition stopped offering it. The gender affirming care executive order is not a law. There was no reason for them to follow this. In New York State, actually, they would be violating our state laws protecting people from being denied this care. But the protest target was not Trump. It was Robert Grossman, who's the CEO of NYU Langone, and the organizers got people chanting his name. They listed his email address and his phone number and a reminder to please be nice to the people who, answer your emails and pick up the phone. Everyone who spoke, the trans kids who are in high school, kids who are just starting college, their care is in jeopardy, they're speaking out. There were union members who spoke out from NYU and at the hospital who were pushing back on the management who were deciding to end care. Cynthia Nixon spoke. She has a trans son who is a patient at the hospital. All of their demands were aimed at the hospital leadership who did not have to obey Trump's order, but chose to. And I think that's really significant as we're looking at sort of what ongoing resistance is going to look like. And it's so much bigger than Trump, which can feel overwhelming, but it makes sense because what put Trump there is bigger than Trump. What put Trump there are systems of oppression and repression that we have been living with for essentially the entire history of this country. The people who maybe were the first in the streets this time, they are among the ones who didn't go anywhere after 2020 just because Trump did. They saw that fascism does not come out of nowhere, that the oppression of patriarchy is just one of its openings and organizing opportunities, and that our own history has provided many such openings and organizing opportunities for fascists. So perhaps the way to defeat it and ensure it doesn't rise again is not nearly to oppose Trump, but to deny fascism those opportunities. Another way to think about that, all these attacks that we've seen on Drag Story Hour, those are fascist organizing opportunities. The attacks on abortion, on clinics, fascist organizing opportunities. Attacks on trans kids, attacks on the healthcare workers who support them, attacks on librarians who don't exclude them. These are all sites of fascist organizing opportunities. And the only sort of I don't even want to say it's hopeful, but one thing I am hopeful about sometimes in the midst of this is that because their targets are so diffuse and they have hit so many people, there are so many people who have an opportunity to resist and push back. They have created this tent of people, who the left hasn't even really been able to successfully create as a unified front. Perhaps this is an opportunity that people who have been targeted already by the far right, who've been targeted already by policies like those Trump has in place, they're the same people who've been fighting for the last few years. They know how to fight, they know how to push back, and that is an opportunity for all of us to learn from what has been working, how communities keep showing up when they're under attack. The last thing that I will say, which I don't know if it's a provocation or not, like, but allow me this. The prison abolitionist Rachel Herzig has observed that the criminal punishment system is the enforcing arm of fascism. And to that, I would add, fascism relies on criminalizing resistance, as we saw in Coeur d'Alene. You know, when we talk about institutions that are hospitable to or truly shaped by male supremacism, by authoritarianism, by white supremacy, we have to consider the police and the prison system and the broader criminal punishment system in the United States. These are the systems that day in and day out are allowing Trump's mass deportation regime to reach into people's homes, their schools, their religious observations, their cars, their walks to campus. Those are the systems that any resistance is going to have to contend with, because as we've seen, Trump's go-to move to justify anything horrific he wants to do is to just call someone a criminal and hope that that's enough to push people away from supporting them. So as far as, you know, resistance to Trump 2.0, where I'm looking also happens to be the people who've been resisting the criminal punishment system, who have an analysis that all of this is actually didn't begin with Trump, that all of this is like laced through with gender and race mythologies and oppressions. You know, I'm looking at queer and trans groups who are sort of outside the big mainstream LGBT groups. I'm looking at reproductive justice activists, abortion fund workers who are sort of working outside of the big reproductive rights groups, anti-violence activists who are working outside of sort of the criminal legal system's responses to domestic violence, environmental justice activists who are targeted by the militia and others, disability justice activists who I think more than anyone have shown us that impact of state abandonment with COVID really exposes what it is that the state could do if it wanted to do and what it chooses not to do, and how powerful that is in dividing communities, and being fuel for conspiracy thinking. The woman in Coeur d'Alene, Teresa Borenpaul, who stood up or just refused to go quietly, you know, one way to understand that moment is she's not just protesting Trump, she's protesting it was abortion that got her to yell back, right? Like, we're always working on multiple things at one time. There's, you know, no one way to sort of organize in this moment, but the one way not to organize, I think, is to organize around opposition to Trump. There has to be something more. And, you know, we have so much more to bring to the table. One thing, though, that I would like to leave just as a question, I legitimately don't have an answer to this, but it came up as I was working on this, is the role of male supremacist ideology in this administration, in this moment. Is it going relatively unspoken because it is so submerged in all of these other issues that are sort of more upfront? Is it just the air that we breathe? And so it's like harder to differentiate and to speak to directly. You know, it is the binding force amongst all these different factions, like kind of the old religious right, the new Christian nationalists, the tech bros, the mainstream Republican Party. Like, male supremacism helps collapse their differences and draws those folks closer together when they have other sort of divides. And, you know, it also allows us not to dismiss Trump as an anomaly, but to see him as a creation of this ideology that forms our history. And so, yeah, I feel like where I've sort of landed is it's male supremacism in this moment is everywhere and nowhere. Like, it's just so suffused the way that power works right now, that it is sometimes hard to name, but it is easy for me to see it in the resistance to that power. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Yeah, I'll hand it over to Soraya.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Melissa. You said a lot of what I'm thinking as well. I think of male supremacy as the connective tissue between these sometimes actually very conflicting forces in the culture. I do think that we're like fish in water, and most people are, I think, very deeply uncomfortable saying the words male supremacy, white supremacy. I mean, none of us here are, but for the most part, I think that it's still very difficult for people to come to terms with just overcoming their discomfort, which is an indicator of the issue that we're dealing with. I'm going to take a step back here, because in thinking about what resistance looks like today, I can't help but think about what it has looked like leading to this moment. And so I want to take a moment to talk particularly about the coalescing of these forces online and socio-technical accelerationism, and how it has propelled and concentrated in a pretty brief amount of time the flashpoints that we're experiencing. In about 2010, I hadn't written really truly for about 20 years. I went back to writing full-time as a feminist, and it was a completely different media environment. And it took zero time to understand that, because I could have written about why boys should be allowed to wear pink socks and there would be a threat. And the threats were multidimensional, because I have a name that suggests I'm Muslim, which I'm not, but there's Islamophobia. I sort of look the way I do, so there's rape right away. Like, if you happen to look feminine and female, rape's going to come at you fast and furiously. Anyway, that was very, very clear, and it was notably different in its scope, in its amplification, in its long-term effects on people's lives. It was happening to me, it was happening to lots of other people. But in response to that, a group of us formed a transnational network of researchers, lawyers, writers, activists, digital and technology experts, data researchers, to come together and confront social media companies with their ideas of content moderation and what constituted free speech and whose speech was allowable and what type of speech was allowable. And we organized in 2012 a global activist confrontation against Facebook that was based on the fact that they had said that they bar hate speech, including misogyny, but they were not doing that by the terms of their own rules. And because we were sort of globally focused, we had more than 100 organizations around the world that co-signed this endeavor. It was fairly intersectional, but its emphasis was on how misogyny itself was excused, and in excusing misogyny, women in every capacity were further harmed by that. So they didn't, for example, know what corrective rape was. So if South African soccer players were being threatened with corrective rape in not so subtle ways, but not using the word rape, Facebook didn't recognize that. They did not understand what that meant in that culture, in that time, as women who were lesbians, et cetera, et cetera. So we did this campaign and managed to set up an escalation channel. A group of us ran the escalation channel for about 7 years. The escalation channel was literally designed to help women who had no recourse at all, but felt very threatened, physically threatened, which for Facebook, the quality of imminent harm was important, even though we tried to explain that that is not the way women generally experience threat and harm, particularly intimate threats and harm. And so the escalation channel then expanded to include, at that point, Twitter and also YouTube. And what I think is notable about that, which we might talk about a bit later, is the way that networked misogyny and hate in general leverages cross-platform movement for which there are no mechanisms, none. There's no way for any one company to manage a cross-platform escalation. And that now we can really see it. We can see the amplification that has come over the years as these platforms have become faster, more dynamic, more creator-driven. That's all to say that those forms of resistance to the violence, to the threats, to the homophobia, the transphobia, the misogyny, I don't want to say they were useless, because at some points they clearly helped individual people, but it was virtually impossible to make any systemic change. And the structure, and so this has led me to where I am now in this conversation, which is that the work that I do now and my thinking that I'm doing now really has to do with the structure of thought that enables all of these forms of supremacy, and trying to talk to people about the granularity of those structures of thought. So I think all of us know what they are: Western, hierarchical, binary, very rigid, in sort of categorical. There are taxonomies of thought. There are rules of the way ideas work. Honestly, what I just described is more or less how content moderation works at these companies. It's all very binary. It's a yes or a no. It's not contextual. If you get a threat, for example, if you get 1,000 rape threats on a page in Facebook, you still have to report them one at a time. And 1,000 different moderators or an AI now will look at it, but it doesn't capture the scope of it. It doesn't capture the intensity of it. And all of that's bad. But in fact, what I think is more relevant right now is how atomistic the process is. And that, to me, is related to hyper-individualism of the culture and of Silicon Valley, all of which I think contribute, obviously, to white supremacy, male supremacy. So I wanted to break these things down and think about what resistance looks like, particularly in a time of acceleration. And I think it's interesting because a lot of what I think Melissa just described in communities that have always been in a protest mode simply by virtue of existing. Some people flit in and out of protest because it's a privilege, it's a luxury, they're buffered by identity or by wealth. There's a moment in time, you show up with the pink pussy hat or you show up on the lawn of the White House. But in fact, if you embody resistance to this system, you don't have that option. And a lot of it is based, a lot of resistance, I think, is based in care and in community and in solidarity. And the thing about those things is they can't be accelerated, right? They are literally structurally opposed to the culture of acceleration and socio-technical acceleration that we're now being subjected to and forced to live in. And so I think that what I'm trying to do in my writing and in my work with other people is to say, okay, let's take a step back. Everything's forcing us to respond to this fire hose. If we think in terms of immediate protest, short-term protest, midterm and long-term, what does it look like? What does it look like if you can think in terms of simply, first of all, seeing what's there? We've just talked about the fact that a lot of people just don't see male supremacy. And if they do, they don't really want to talk about it. And there are lots of studies that show that of all different forms of discrimination, most people don't see gender discrimination. They rationalize it, launder it through religion or gender norms or biological essentialism, all the things that I know that we're talking about this week. So it sounds really basic, but it is literally see it, name it, say the words out loud, normalize the language, and then link it to everyday life so that the protest doesn't become the moment in time, but that people start to understand that living the way they choose to live, the way they choose to socialize younger people, the way they choose to interact with institutions is protest. They need to understand that if they are ethically and morally opposed to supremacy in all of its forms, you can't go in and out of that. You really have to think of it as a worldview shift. And it is, I think the way I think of it today is that we've kind of hit the limits of supremacist imaginations, male supremacist imaginations, white supremacist imaginations. Like when I look at the tech, when I look at the tech bros and their visions of the future, like, 7, 8 years ago, if you talk to people about the dark enlightenment and long-termism and the kind of kookiness of having monarchical city-states, that like all of those things, really people would look at you as though you'd lost your mind or were detached from reality in some other way. But in fact, this is an active, ongoing, very public endeavor to build an alternative kind of future. But it doesn't matter if it's those city-states or if it's transhumanism. All of those visions, to me, are just rehashings of Christian arcs of sin, redemption, and eternal life in purity. Like you can map those things almost directly onto those visions of the future. And those visions of the future are the same imagination. They are the same old kind of patriarchal, now macho fascist ideology of domination and control and hierarchy, and exploitation and extraction of people from people's bodies, extraction from the land, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that in thinking about protest, I've just gotten to the point where I'm so happy if people want to show up and protest on the streets, but in fact, it needs to be such a diffuse, rhizomatic, networked kind of way of life that people understand, is not just in response to the bad things that are happening, but with the goal of building the alternatives and building the alternatives with real consciousness. And so I'll wrap this up because I think I'm probably at the end of my time. I think of it as intimate refusals of inequality, of micro defiance, in the same way we all experience sort of micro fascism, micro defiance to that fascism, building alternative knowledge structures. When things go away, I've seen just remarkable examples of people saying, okay, we are going to reproduce that. We're going to find that data. We're going to keep that data. We're going to share that data. Finding immediate skills and people with resources. And it is totally exhausting. 100% there with Melissa. It's all exhausting for everybody all the time. But in fact, if you're going to be exhausted, which you will be anyway, you might as well be exhausted doing something that builds a different, better vision of the world. And then I think the last two things are rethinking our relationships to institutions. I think that's really hard, particularly for white Americans in this moment, because even something like abolition doesn't make sense to a lot of people because they aren't immersed in it and they don't really, it's just it's contrary to their socialization. Hopefully that's changing, but I do think that changing cultural narratives, thinking about institutional transformation, and reimagining power is really, I think, what we're talking about as a form of resistance. So I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you so much, Soraya. Yeah, now I'm going to pass it over to Ali. So Alia.
Hi, thanks. Oh my gosh, I'm so self-conscious for so many reasons right now, but I did want to, and I know we're talking about very serious things, but I just want to congratulate myself that I remembered to close my bathroom door for the first time ever on a Zoom. So I just winning. I'm self-conscious for so many reasons, but I just like, because I am sort of verbose. And so I do think that what I want to talk about is a little bit longer than 20 minutes, but we'll see. Maybe I can speed up or cut down. But Marley, I have slides.
I can share them
right.
right now.
Okay, yay.
And I will put them in present mode.
I also just discovered Canva. So I can't, not all technology is bad. But guys, thank you so much. I feel like a bobblehead because I just keep like every time that it's all resonating so much. And I'm so glad to be here, with everybody today. I want to talk about the findings from my book on women and online abuse, which was, so getting back to the self-consciousness, I think that some of what I want to talk about feels kind of obvious, like it should be obvious, and it sort of is kind of obvious. But I think sometimes when we are exhausted or we are sort of facing all these real intense material difficult things, these threats, we can sort of lose sight of obvious things. We can almost lose sight of our humanity in a way. So I wanted to talk a bit about the findings of my book, which really sort of focus on psychological mitigations. You keep hearing the word sort of exhaustion, and I think it's I think obviously we need a lot of technological tools, but we also need ways of just kind of getting through the day. I mean, this didn't make it into my book, but somebody said something to me once, which was, what is the narrative of reform doing for women today? And I was just like, oh yeah, that's actually sort of an interesting way of thinking about like, what do I just need in this moment to kind of survive? So I wanted to put this, so you can go to the first slide. Actually, and I'm so technologically inept. How did I lose sight of where? Oh, I can see the screen. You can go to the next slide, Marley. Thank you so much. I wanted to start with this quote here because I just think it's so apt in the current moment. And it really stresses, I think right now, this, not only this notion of resistance, but the importance of sort of speech, right? Like not only politically, but for a human life. Obviously, you know, there's so many reasons to be online, right? We're trying to share our research, to write, to publicly think, to organize, to agitate. But we're also sort of here to self-define, right? That's like such a huge part of what it means to be human, right? The desire to tell the truth, not just about the world, but about who we are and what we've experienced. And so I really like this quote. What we can't separate lives from the accounts given of them. The articulation of our experience is part of our experience. It matters to us what is said about us, who says it, and to whom it is said. Having the opportunity to talk about one's life, to give an account of it, to interpret it, is integral to leading that life rather than being led through it. You know, I wrote a book on women and online abuse based on years of sort of interviewing experts in psychology, sociology, philosophy, neuroscience, technology, as well as, you know, obviously talking to dozens and dozens of women with diverse identities who sort of suffered this violence. And, you know, of course, online abuse is a problem that sort of spans the ideological and political spectrum. And it's kind of interesting in interviews that I've been doing about the book, I can sense that people really want to stress that. They're like, well, you know, it's kind of bad for everybody online. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, right? There's lots of reasons for this abuse, right? You know, money, politics, norms of behavior online. But I was interested in sort of online abuse that's really perpetuating, right? These kind of hierarchies of power. And you know, what was obvious in these interviews that I did is that, you know, how we experience the problem of online abuse, online misogyny, online hate is influenced by you know, so many factors, right? Our gender, our race, the kind of cultural, geographical, political context that we're operating in, who our antagonists are, right? Some of us are being attacked by trolls. Some of us are being attacked by people in our field. Some of us are being attacked by organized crime. Some of us are being attacked by our governments. But I do think there are lessons in this reporting that are sort of applicable to all of us, especially around this idea that anybody should be asked to ignore online abuse, which I think is very much, which is sometimes the message we get, right? Like sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. And that is so at odds with what it means to be human, right? Humans are not built to ignore violence or threat or rejection or exclusion, certainly not attacks on our dignity and our safety and our autonomy. So I think it's worth stating that I wrote a book about women and online abuse, but I think all of this is really sort of applicable to all forms of violence and difficulty sort of experienced online and off, which is important, right? Because all of it's kind of connected. So, okay, I'm just trying to be careful of the time here. Okay, I think it's worth stating that I didn't interview a single woman who was ignoring it, right? Like ignoring it. And I think that sometimes when women are told to ignore violence, it can mean don't react. And I think other times it can mean don't feel. And I think that latter part is really sort of the problem, right? I mean, certainly there were women that I interviewed who were not consciously sort of hurt by their online abuse, but that doesn't mean that they weren't angry or frustrated or harmed, right? Psychologically, reputationally, economically, or that they weren't sort of troubled by the harm that toxic language is creating for other women, right? Online and off, for a society. Everybody that I interviewed was sort of doing something with their abuse, right? Whether it was reporting it, dismissing it, compartmentalizing it, exposing it. I just wanted to emphasize that there wasn't a single person who wasn't grappling with it in some way, how it was affecting them and how it was affecting women as kind of a social group. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So the first kind of animating question for my book is, why can't we ignore it, right? Like we're intelligent, we're smart, we know what's kind of going on here, right? Like we know what we're facing, we're incredibly resilient. Like, why can't we ignore it? And I think also, I believe that even if a woman had kind of accommodated to some of these experiences, ignoring is not really the right word, right? For how people are kind of managing their abuse. So I interviewed this philosopher, and her name is Lynn Terrell, and she told me that, learning not to care about the damage isn't the same as not being damaged. So again, we're not built to ignore information, language, threat, and obviously words have social and political meanings, right? When you know the history of a word, it's very hard to set that aside. So there's a biological reality here that I just want to emphasize, right? Words have potent effects because, the regions of our brain that process language are the same parts of our brain that control major systems that support our body's metabolic budget. These are the parts of our brain that guide our heart rates and adjust glucose and manage our immune system. So, the kind connective words really function as deposits toward our body, right? Toward these body budgets. And malicious words really function as withdrawals. So, the power of words is not a metaphor, wrote neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett. Words are tools for regulating human bodies. Other people's words have a direct effect on your brain activity and your bodily systems. And your words have that same effect on other people. Whether you intend that effect is irrelevant. It's how we're wired. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I said this a couple of times now, but obviously our bodies respond to stress and fear. They're supposed to, right? And many of these online attacks are incredibly stressful. They're terrifying. I know when I was targeted by an online mob a few years ago, I actually thought that I was going to die during it. And it's hard to kind of say that out loud because I think that, obviously, I don't want to. I recognize that obviously so many people have had experiences of in-person physical violence, and I don't want to suggest these things are the same, but I do want to say that online abuse is a deeply physical experience. I believed in the moment that my body wasn't able to sort of intellectualize around the experience. I thought if it was possible to die from being afraid or being anxious, that I could. And so, you might try to tell yourself these are just words, but your body obviously understands certain words in certain contexts as threat. And obviously we're not just talking about words, we're talking about images, videos, but sort of the same idea, right? Feeling threatened raises your stress level. It gets your adrenaline pumping and your cortisol going. It shuts down your appetite. It makes you think that, you can't sleep because you have to stay alert. So I also think it's true that obviously, all of this language reflects a culture that has made it permissible, right, for people to commit in-person physical violence against you, right? So we know that violent language can be used to make other forms of violence permissible. Victims of hateful speech experience physiological symptoms, and words contribute significantly to non-linguistic actions that may indeed break bones, as well as have many other corrosive material effects. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I do want to talk about, just very briefly, and then we'll talk about practical sort of strategies. But, I did want to say this, that we hear so much about like this notion of having thicker skin, or we got to be really tough to be in these spaces. And I'm not trying to sort of be obtuse, but I do sometimes really wonder kind of what that means, because thick skin isn't going to keep information from getting to your brain. That's not how we were built. And I also think that many of us are not necessarily striving for a life where we feel less. Stoicism is really sort of a white supremacist value, and I don't want to hold that up as a virtue or as a model. And so I wanted to just say that, especially for people who've had these experiences, as they're doing their work, what was so clear to me in my reporting was that it wasn't that like some people had thick skin and other people were really sort of weak and fragile. It was that, you know, we have different experiences, right? That engender different responses to violence. We have different resources. We have different lives. And so our responses to this kind of violence are not, you know, decided by the proverbial thickness of our skins. They're influenced by the rich and deep variability of our lives. And I still think about this quote from an op-ed that Roxane Gay wrote a few years ago. Who was served by all this thick skin? If we all had the thickest of skins, no one would have to take responsibility for cruelties, big or small. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I began my book, my work, my inquiry sort of wanting to know how women were surviving experiences of abuse online. And I really wanted to know how they were coping. And I thought, sort of naively, that I would, there would be a clear number of sort of beneficial strategies and I could arrange them. And it would be a neat, nice, handy little guide. And, didn't work that way for me or my publisher. So that's unfortunate. But also, there's a complex reality here, right? What coping involves a number of strategies that are influenced by alternating priorities. And in the context of oppression, we know the defining feature, right, of it, which is that it's that double bind. So everywhere there are these binds and everywhere we're sort of getting tied up, right? So a great example of this, I thought, was, we can see this through the concept of emotion regulation, which is defined by psychologist James Gross as the processes by which individuals influence which emotions they have, when they have them, how they experience and express these emotions. It's something that can be done unconsciously, it can be taught. And I thought, yeah, obviously this is a reasonable, this is reasonable, right? For coping with difficult things. Things are, discrimination is terrible for health. Things feel awful, things are awful. And so you sort of do, you do what you can to kind of manage your emotions and to feel better, because, as we've been talking about, right? This is the long history of this, right? That we're not going to figure this out in quickly, right? So it behooves us, right, to sort of learn to regulate our emotions around the violence we face so we can minimize their disruptions to our lives. But then, I kind of began to find the trouble, right, in this kind of notion. So in 2018, there's a philosopher by the name of Alfred Archer, and he came across a paper by another philosopher, Amia Srinivasan, in which she writes that victims of oppression they're often asked to turn away from valid emotional responses to give themselves the best chance of ending that oppression. And this choice, she argued, was constituted an effective injustice, because it's forcing victims of injustice to make a choice, a really kind of tragic choice, between emotionally recognizing their experiences and doing what they can to address them. So Archer was thinking about her paper when he ended up going to this conference where James Gross was a keynote speaker, and Archer and another philosopher by the name of Georgina Mills began to think about the relationship between effective injustice and emotion regulation. And they basically concluded that the demand faced by victims of oppression is a demand that they regulate their emotions. And, of course, some form of emotion regulation is so necessary to survive life. But I think in the context of oppression, it's the act of trying to control your emotional state all the time is fundamentally unjust, especially if you're being asked to sort of tamp down certain emotions in order to be heard, to be taken seriously, to be allowed in the room. And I think a further sort of complication in terms of what might be sort of most useful for women experiencing an identity-based attack is that we all have different goals, and different goals require different sort of psychological strategies, right? The goal of fighting the oppressor, it's different, or it can be different than the goal of sort of psychologically preserving yourself in a moment. So, if you want to fight the oppressor, maybe you're leaning into your anger and you're channeling it. And if the goal is to, sort of psychologically preserve yourself, maybe you are cognitively sort of reappraising and rethinking a situation to convince yourself that something is not as bad as it actually is. Because the story that you tell yourself to feel better doesn't actually have to be true. We can go to the next slide. When I was thinking about, when I was trying to write about this difficulty, this, specifically around emotional regulation, I kept kind of, running into complication after complication because, there is a ton of research and literature on how to, cope, right? On what is effective in terms of coping with difficulty. But a lot of that research, most of that research, is not done in the context of discrimination. So there's sort of few fast and hard rules here, but I did really appreciate this quote from a psychologist who I had interviewed around the trauma of the January 6th insurrection. And he told me that, if I hope this is useful. It was helpful to me that, if someone is upset about their abuse and is sort of beating themselves up about, being upset, right? Wishing they had thicker skin or thinking they can't do the work or that they shouldn't be sharing ideas or research publicly if they can't handle them emotionally. He told me he would encourage them to really sort of notice those thoughts and to loosen those attachments and to sort of question all those assumptions. And he said this to me, that maybe you could ask yourself something like, to any of the people I know who have expressed who they truly are in spite of society's criticism or hatred, who have really changed society, have they done it without some level of abuse? Is it worth what it's going to cost? And the answer might be no, but someone might realize nothing says this should be easy. And there can be real sort of relief in that and realizing this is hard. It's hard. That's exactly how it is. So I never wanted to write a prescriptive book because I can't know sort of what strategies another person has the capacity to engage in. And, like I said, we're all, have different resources. Some of us have institutions behind our back. Some of us have financial resources, right? Different skills. We have different goals. And we all ultimately want to do, different things, right? With this one sort of precious life that we had. So I didn't want to write a prescriptive book, but I do think that there are ways to mitigate harm. And some, all of these strategies have sort of benefits and drawbacks. But I wanted to talk about, what I heard from the women that I interviewed and then kind of end on what was among the sort of most effective strategies. So we can go to the next slide. So many of the women that I interviewed use humor to cope. Laughter feels really good. It has, sort of positive physiological effects. It's, connective because jokes are often made in the presence of other people, right? I couldn't have made my bathroom door joke to myself, or I could have, but it wouldn't, it worked better, with this room. So humor can, humor has a ton of functions. It can also sort of serve overall kind of meaning making. And it can be a way to sort of subvert the violence itself, which was true for one of the feminist comedians that I interviewed for the book. I have frankly made many jokes to myself to kind of survive some of these experiences. We can go to the next slide. So we're here with Soraya, so of course it's fitting to talk about anger. And she writes this in her book. Rage becomes her that anger it's legitimate, it's necessary, and the problem isn't the anger itself. It's the mismanagement of the anger, which can really make us sick and sort of less effective at accomplishing our goals. So, Soraya tells us, and I agree, to develop a kind of anger competence, a way to hone and harness anger that involves awareness, talking, listening, and strategizing. And I would say many of the women that I interviewed were extremely angry, and that anger was incredibly animating. I mean, I was so angry, I wrote a book about it. That, there we go. Okay, next slide. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the idea of sort of logging off. Obviously, sometimes it's important to log off in small doses to sort of remind ourselves that there is more to life than what's on the screen. Sometimes we need to log off because we can't do the work, right? That is sort of more important, more impactful when we're constantly experiencing these attacks. I interviewed a trans lawmaker for the book who had to get off at the time Twitter because it was compromising her ability to do that legislative work, right? That was more impactful to the trans community. So I do want to say that, logging off can sometimes be necessary, but I also don't want it to be confused with the kind of idea of, well, just log off, as a response to this abuse, which is kind of a really minimizing response. The idea of logging off or looking away can kind of fall into this bucket of avoidance coping, which sometimes gets a bad rap, but as one psychologist I interviewed told me, there isn't always value in always approaching difficult things. It is, again, really about whether it's, worth what it's going to cost. Okay, next slide. A lot of the women that I interviewed expose their abuse online to sort of raise awareness, to reject discrimination, to call for empathy. And I didn't actually have when I first started the reporting, I didn't know what to call it. I kept calling it different things. And then at some point you sort of realize that in many cases, what women are doing here, with their screenshots and their commentaries, it's qualifying as counter speech, which really seeks to mitigate the harms of bad speech with more good speech. It's communication that really tries to counteract potential harm. And I think it's a really important sort of strategy worth studying because it is so often favored, right? Sort of over restrictions. So it sort of behooves us to see, where it's kind of most effective and where it's limited. Okay, next slide. I wanted to briefly mention desensitization because many women I interviewed told me they were desensitized to their online abuse, and some told me that they felt like that was really a reason why they were able to remain online. And I guess certainly, if you're sort of less emotionally responsive to being called a slur, that might be a good thing in the sense that you can sort of, tolerate, I guess, some of what's happening in these spaces. But that diminished responsiveness can also sort of normalize violence and also, sort of exact other psychological costs, right? So just because someone's desensitized to their online abuse doesn't mean that they aren't, experiencing other forms of disillusionment or withdrawal, right? Like literature on people who live in violent communities shows that, they might be desensitized to violence, but that doesn't mean that they aren't, depressed or anxious or feeling other forms of despair. So I also think it's worth noting that desensitization can make our threat response system less effective. I interviewed an OBGYN who told me that she once got a really threatening message after, experiencing that kind of abuse for years. And she showed a friend and the friend said, you have to call law enforcement. And she told me that it didn't even register to her as something sort of worth attending to. And she told me in order to combat violence, you have to fight your own experiences. And I think that's just, it's a really, sort of tough statement to hear, but it's true. It's another sort of consequence of desensitization. Okay, next slide. Very briefly, I think this is very fitting for us here today. Almost all the women I interviewed for this book held a very strong sense of purpose. And, sometimes they used it to kind of affirm what they were doing and why it mattered. Sometimes they used it to kind of reorient themselves. And I know this is very true for me. And I do just love that quote, he who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. Okay, next slide. Yeah, I wrote a whole chapter on therapy, and I'll just say this, that I think that when you're talking about gender-based violence and you're talking about oppression, like saying talk to a mental health professional is just, it's just too vague. I mean, there's a psychotherapist by the name of Bonnie Burstow, and she really emphasized that women need a therapist who understand that violence is absolutely integral to our experience as women. Sort of endlessly intervening on the, upon the individual is never gonna, be healing, right? If you're not sort of looking at the social, political, and kind of economic factors contextualizing a person's pain. So I thought this was a great quote from Dr. Thema Bryant, who told me, we don't want to say just cope with racism, cope with sexism, and just go light candles and take a bubble bath. those things are good to feed yourself, but then you feed yourself for the fight to go back and combat it, to eradicate it, to push back, to call it out, to name it. Okay, we got two more, guys. We got this. Confrontation. Let's go to, this is one that I was sort of hesitant to include because it was a true finding. It is a true finding, but it's also the case that it sort of goes against some, advice from online safety experts. But many women that I interviewed really do speak back to their antagonists. And they told me that they experienced really sort of practical and psychological benefits when they engaged in confrontational coping. And I think it's worth noting that having these kind of blanket statements, right, about how to cope with things, right? Telling a woman to never respond to abuse might ignore her sort of unique vulnerabilities and the culturally specific ways that she copes and their, that person's sort of relationship even to likability and respectability politics. I interviewed a Black woman for the book, Mickey Kendall, cultural critic, and she said, the advice that white women give themselves about how to cope with online abuse is like makes no sense to me. So I just think that that's important. Okay, the final thing, right? Okay, so every woman that I interviewed for this book said she survived her experiences, that she continues to be able to be in these online spaces because of social support, right? It's the group text, the colleague who gets it, the friend who picks up the phone, feeling that we are loved and valued by other people is such a key component of well-being, right? And it also connects to that sort of larger concept of solidarity when we are committed to working with other people, right? In that sort of larger transformative struggle. Social support is it's so evidence-based. It acts as a buffer against bad outcomes. It makes us feel validated and less alone. And another quote that really stuck with me from the reporting was from a psychologist. Her name's Emily Sachs. She does a lot of work with journalists who've experienced online abuse. And she told me, social support can counter the stressor by reminding ourselves of who we are, that we do belong in community, that we have value, that we're not damaged goods, that the world has good and justice and love in it, as well as toxic elements, that we may be safer than our bodies feel, that people will show up. So, this book concludes with the idea that there is no, sort of surviving this alone. Not any of it, online or off. And as one woman who ran a pro Amber Heard account during the Johnny Depp defamation trial told me, if I didn't have this group of people who were helping me and who I could talk to, I don't think I could still do this. I don't think I could still do it if it was just me. And I think that's probably a fitting place to end. I don't think I've ever talked faster in my life, but thank you guys. I'm so happy to be here with you in solidarity. These are some of the women that I interviewed. Oh, good job. You remembered I had more slides. I forgot more slides. You can go to the next one. These are just some of the women that I interviewed for the book. And on the last slide, if you're interested in talking to me, I'm interested in talking to you. That's all I got.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alia. Yeah, so now I'm going to ask a couple questions to the speakers and then open it to the audience for questions, and I'll ask those. But yeah, the first one I wanted to ask was, if you all could talk about what has and hasn't surprised you about feminist resistance to the second Trump administration so far as we're approaching, these first 100 days.
Sort of alluded to this in parts of my talk. It was really strange to me the way that it seemed like from the mainstream media coverage, the Women's March was still being held up as sort of like, this is what the resistance looks like, / this is what feminist resistance looks like. So on one hand, I guess I have to appreciate that a feminist event became like the stand-in for the resistance. But it also just feels like such a burden, and also still like out of step with the reality of the moment, like coming into 2025. I think it was like very easy for people to sort of believe this narrative of like the women were going to save us, and sometimes specifically Black women were going to save us, and like they didn't. So, oh well, they're all staying home. And there's lots of reasons to take a step back after the election, But I don't think that's actually what was happening. I think people were, as Soraya mentioned, like turning to their own communities, to building networks of care, to doing mutual aid work. Like when I think of feminist resistance in these first few months, like I'm thinking of what people are doing, like really urgently raising money for abortion funds, doing know your rights trainings, thinking of ways to support families who, might be facing like food insecurity, because like we're looking at like huge economic crash with all of this. Like I think it's much more about like how are we going to sustain and pull through this moment, and like the act of building those networks might be more meaningful than showing up in the streets for just one day. And I think that like that work might not be as visible. It doesn't necessarily show up on the front page of the New York Times, but sometimes that's also okay, particularly as more and more of what we are doing to care for ourselves and as acts of resistance is being criminalized. I think it's more than fine to do the work that you're doing a little bit offline, a little bit harder to find.
Can I say something too about sort of what is and isn't surprising? I'm not surprised that I find mainstream media's treatment of these issues deplorable. Genuinely, language, framing, photos, like I can't personally even stand to look at it most days because I get so agitated. But I'm looking at this question here, and I'm not going to answer for you, Alia, but I do think all of us are capable of narrative change. I think all of us are capable of critical media awareness and analysis. I couldn't, for example, as a parent, I could not protect my children against the culture. All I could really do was give them an analytical framework, a way of seeing the world that might help them. And I think we all understand the harms of the media systems that we not only use, but are so immersed in. The entire, like everything runs on these media systems. And so I think that as individuals, I'm still surprised by mainstream media's stubbornness. I'm not, because I understand the demographics of mainstream media newsrooms. I'm both surprised and unsurprised by the same fact. So I just want to say that one of the things that I think is important is to think about narrative change, even if you're having dinner. Like you're sitting there, you're having dinner, somebody uses language, they say something, you can find a way to say, you know what, we're not going to do that. Maybe you should think about this other thing. And it's kind of that notion that every day-to-day interaction, it doesn't have to be pressureful or exhausting, but it can just become a habit. It's a habit of mind and a habit of relating to other people. I'm not a lot of fun at dinner parties, probably, for my friends, but it's okay. They keep inviting me.
I'll go to dinner with you. I have so many thoughts, but I'm not going to say them all. So I think what Melissa said is so good, like such a true, I am not in a newsroom right now. But I did a lot of reporting on what feminism was, what we thought feminism was going to look like. The feminist movement was going to, sort of what that project would be like under the first Trump presidency. And of course, that was such a different moment. The moment of the transfer of power, we had people, hundreds of thousands of people flooding Washington, D.C. But what I heard then is probably, which is still true now from all of the feminists that I sort of interviewed for some of those stories, was that feminism was going to need to be understood not just as a fad, but as something that was completely essential to democracy. And it's been frustrating. I guess I'm not really answering the surprise piece because I don't know that surprise is what I feel. I feel a lot of things. I don't know if it's surprise is the emotion that I'm having. But I think, it's really, it's hard to sort of, you understand why that project is so difficult, right? To sort of get that message out there, particularly in a moment where, or in a time period where, Soraya's commenting on the, mainstream media. I also think, the new news media ecosystem, right, online, which is, full of these creators that it's very male dominated, it's very, conservative leaning. It's another sort of challenge here, right, in sort of being able to get that, kind of message out. I guess the one thing I will say, I'm not surprised, maybe I was a little bit surprised. Were we surprised about this space mission? I mean, this all-female space mission. I mean, I was having like a moment where I just couldn't believe the way that like feminism was able to be exploited in like in that way. But I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by it. That space mission was something. So yeah, I just think I agree also that there's a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes that is it doesn't have to be hundreds of thousands of people in Washington, D.C. I just watched a hearing at like a California State Assembly with a few very, committed, experts and activists who were supporting one another and speaking about the harms of male technology, male facilitated online violence. And I bet how many people watched that? I don't know, like not many, right? But it was still, it's those things are happening. Those things are always happening. And I think that it's important to remember that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for those brilliant points. And yeah, regarding that space mission, I was definitely surprised in terms of like it happening in 2025. It seemed like such like a 2012 stunt. But anyway, the next question I wanted to ask was, we're seeing platforms like Twitter, owned by Elon Musk, and Meta, owned by Mark Zuckerberg, have both, substantially rolled back content moderation recently and are increasingly allowing neo-Nazis and violent misogynists to quite literally profit off of hate. And we're also navigating, the rise of sexually abusive deepfake content and, that adding a new dimension to all of that across social media. Can you talk about the expanding horizons of online misogyny and abuse in recent years?
Can I jump in with something? I'm going to go back to mainstream media for one moment. In 2014 or 15, when Gamergate was happening, there was clearly an emphasis, and I wasn't able to attend all day today, but I did hear the last, I heard part of the last session, and we've been talking about words. A lot of what we've been talking about with network misogyny has focused on words, and that is in itself a male supremacist bias, because what women are targeted with in far disproportion are images. First, photographs, memes, abuse of their own photographs, and then videos, and then deepfake videos. And at every single stage of those escalations over the last 10 years, mainstream media refused to deal with what it meant because they treated it as a private harm rooted in shame to individual women. So when Nancy Pelosi's slowed down, it wasn't even a deepfake. It was just a very bad slowed down video that made her look like she slurred her words. That catalyzed panic on Capitol Hill. There were hearings, experts came in, and all I can really say about that is that some guys understood that it might happen to them and that they may look bad in a deep fake. For years, there were many of us talking to lawmakers, talking to editors about the fact that women were being turned into pornography as political mis and disinformation. And I remember this so clearly because I spent 3 hours on the phone with an editor at the Washington Post explaining the difference between mis and disinformation and trying to convince this person that the fact that every prominent woman politician that you could think of was portrayed in Mr. Deepfake, which was the name of the website, and they just wouldn't run the piece because it was too pornographic, it was too obscene, they couldn't do links, right? And so that public-private divide, that gendered split between what constitutes threat, violence, misinformation, disinformation, I'm going to throw myself at this group of excellent thinkers and researchers and say, please focus on imagery and less on the words, because we're moving that way anyway in the world. but the degree to which images are used, are proliferated, I can't really overstate. And the other thing I will say about that is that it is also, it implicates cognition in a different way. So if you think right now about Gen Z men and their rightward position vis-a-vis Gen Z women, those men are the boys of Gamergate, right? And we really, I mean, we didn't talk about pornography in the last hour, but if you think about the cognition that becomes implicated when you're looking at images versus consuming words, I think that's very meaningful in how male supremacy is transmitted epistemically throughout the system in all of these systems. So I'm kind of being incoherent, but I'm literally just begging this group of people to think about the difference between the words and the pictures and the way we consume this information. And frankly, like, too many parents still think that games are toys the way they grew up with like Tinker Toys. They don't understand that games are networks, social networks, and that they are dense with grooming, like people who are grooming boys for all sorts of reasons, you know, and still mainly boys. And so I can't remember how I got here, but I'm just I'm begging for someone to map the imagery as much as the words, because the words, frankly, are behind us now. You know, we're deeply in the other thing. I'll mute myself.
Yeah, I do appreciate that point. I was thinking about when I was thinking about a couple of years ago when I was targeted by like the worst experience that I had with online harassment. There was something about, I mean, the language, I was still having a very like serious reaction to the language, but there was also something deeply, felt deeply dangerous about the people who use my face, right? Who took my image and were also like creating content to harass me and attack me based on that. Something felt, I also almost have it also when people say my name, right? Like when people do a direct address, there's something that sort of changes about the quality of that kind of abuse. So I do really appreciate all those points. I guess I would say also on like, I don't know, the evolution of these things. I mean, Soraya is so much more of an expert on this than I am, like just in terms of like she's been doing this for, you know, so much longer. So some of these things I'm sort of coming to a little bit late, but I do think that what's been on my mind more recently has been kind of the what somebody said to me in the book, which is like the professionalization of the harassment campaign, kind of the monetization of all of this, which obviously we saw with the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard defamation trial, right? You had, you know, people making YouTube videos about like video games who then saw that you could make anti-Amber Heard content and get, you know, millions and millions of views. And that was super profitable, right? And it wasn't just online. There was a continuation, and that's the point. I mean, when Soraya and I spoke about this, like for the book, it's a continuation, right, of things. These things are deeply connected. It wasn't just, you know, that it was justice for Johnny Depp T-shirts, right, that people were selling and then wearing, you know, on the street. And while I haven't done any reporting on this, so I need to be careful about how I speak about this. But there are a lot of journalists. There are a handful of journalists who I deeply respect who have also been covering, you know, what's been going on with the Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni sort of case, that and you know, drawing real sort of similarities, right, in terms of what we saw with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard and what we're kind of seeing now. So I mean, you know, the profit piece is really tough to stomach, and I also think, you know, this generally the open antagonism that some of the people who run these platforms seem to now have. I mean, there was probably always the case, but the comfort with sort of openly having this kind of antagonistic relationship with users is tough. And I think it's, you know, it's you know, it's worth everybody kind of looking at, you know, what it means to kind of be in these spaces on these platforms that are so antithetical to our values. I mean, I think it's a tough kind of conversation to have with yourself and with your community.
I don't have that much to add, but just two things. It had not occurred to me, and I don't know if this is a genuine excuse, Soraya, that news outlets would refuse to cover image-driven abuse because, oh, we can't link to that. And I was just thinking, like, well, who is doing some coverage on that right now that is it independent media? You know, like 404 Media has done some coverage. Is that because they have the freedom to link to these things, or they are more immersed in online culture and know how to read these things? Like, I'm not even sure if that was like a genuine objection or just sort of like a dodge to say like, oh, actually, we can't cover this because, you know, the images are explicit or something.
I still think
That's
they're looking for what they call a family-friendly mainstream audience. And when you put the fact that women are being, like women politicians are being depicted as enforced in rape scenes, they literally are trying to find ways not to have those words strung together, and they definitely can't use images, but Nancy Pelosi slurring her words is easy, right? It's not that hard by comparison. I think people are better because, frankly, some people are talking about it now. Some women, like in 2015, we did a video PSA that had 12 women politicians talking about their experiences. And those women who were in the public eye and being harassed this way struggled with using words to describe the pictures, struggled with their emotional response to describe, to say, because they didn't want to be upset, right? It's upsetting and they didn't want to be upset. And then the media coverage of those things obfuscated the really, truly terrible and very deeply male supremacist language and imagery, right? Like you can't, when the act of penetration is a specific humiliation that you inflict on a person, and it is gendered and sometimes it is raced, it is many, many things. But, an average op-ed in a mainstream newspaper, they are really balking at talking about those things and certainly describing them. So it could have just been that editor. It was a very long call and we finally wrapped it up and didn't get anywhere.
The only other thing I'd add is just you would think that Elon Musk would be like the perfect vehicle to tell this story of like where Gamergate gets you and the complicity of the platforms with the ways that they resist any attempts at content moderation, while pretending they also aren't, and the bullshit free speech arguments that they make. Like, if we don't like nail this story through him, like I don't have a lot of hope about that story. And it's something I've been following for a long time, like I was covering tech in San Francisco in 2007, 2008, 2009, working for Valleywag, Gawker's tech blog before it got blown up by Peter Thiel, another one. Um, you know, I'm kind of like running out of hope on that story if we can't break through with Elon Musk. And I'm curious to hear also maybe from some women who have worked for him. Like there were a couple of good Facebook memoirs that came out in that way. Like
I've
I
seen
think,
none. Have you seen
yeah,
any? I've seen no women come out,
I think
except
they're
the ones
speaking
that
through
he's had
lawsuits,
babies with
maybe,
now.
some of the litigation from his former workers. But yeah, I'm just, I mean, it also might not be necessary. Like part of me feels like we can talk about the ramifications of that moment in maybe more granular ways that reach people. Like it's also hard to like hold on to the fact that like there are very many people who are voting who like don't have a single memory of that
No,
moment.
no,
So
nobody really. And there's no Gamergate, I think for some of us was a turning point, like Elliot Rodgers, right? Like there are just moments when you're like, oh, things just tilted. It just we just had an inflection point. But yeah, I'm really it's really stunning how many people don't know anything about Gamergate that are writing about what's happening now. Right? They maybe heard of Pizzagate, maybe, but not Gamergate. And I think that's really, really a problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you all for your thoughts on those questions. And we have one question from Kelly Jones about yeah, you mentioned language as a form of resistance and language as power to harm as well. Can you name specific ways reporters and academics can use their words to counter harm? Yeah, and this was for Aaliyah, but yeah, if you all want to share insights as well too.
Yeah, everybody should share. I mean, Soraya did a little sharing, and I think that was right, that we all have the capacity, ability, the obligation, right, to use our words to challenge narratives, right, to introduce different narratives. I mean, I'm not an academic, so I don't know that I can sort of I think it's helpful to, I think for me as a journalist, I can sort of speak to the, sort of conversations that I've been having with myself as I haven't been in a newsroom for a few years. I left to kind of work on this project. And I really had to think a lot about my past coverage, frankly, and the ways in which I invisibilized certain forms of harm, and maybe contributed to other people's harm, by sort of, in many ways, by being sort of undereducated or miseducated about certain kinds of things, and or even just not even understanding, certain things about, Soraya's talking about like how ridiculous it is, or the absurdity or the problem of so many reporters not even, even knowing what Gamergate was, right? I mean, there was a lack of education I had even around how to, one of the practices that we used to, when you're writing on these, you're writing on these ridiculous deadlines, right? And they're like, okay, like everybody's talking about this thing, go do this thing in like, 7 minutes. And you're like, okay, I got this. And, you don't have time to call anybody. So you're going on to these, you're going on Twitter, you're going on X, you're going on Instagram, and you're sort of pulling other people's language, right? And they don't know. They're talking maybe to their community, or maybe their profiles are open. They don't really, they're not talking certainly to you, and they're not thinking that their words are going to be pulled and put into a, story on USA Today that's going out to like millions and millions of people. But I have, sort of made that mistake before, where I was, I think it was when it was the Will Smith and Chris Rock, it was the slap at the Oscars, and we were turning content so quickly. And I remember I pulled a comment from a Black Indigenous woman who was talking about sort of language as violence. And I was so excited. Oh, this person is saying the exact thing that I think sort of is the point that needs to be made, but I didn't ask, and I didn't warn her. And it was a real sort of lesson there, right, in my own sort of complicity and my own kind of power, and the power that I have, right, as a journalist, and the ways that I kind of need to hold myself accountable. But I think, like, more specifically, when I'm thinking about, listening to, talking about misinformation and disinformation, that's on my mind a lot. Like when I'm thinking about journalists and language and harm, is, a lot of us are not in this environment really trained on how to spot. I guarantee you, if you were to poll people in a newsroom, like what the difference is between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, most reporters wouldn't know. And that's a problem, because these are distinct things, right? And we sort of can sort of unwittingly become purveyors of disinformation ourselves. And we know that so much misinformation and disinformation is precisely what is used to justify online attacks, to justify violence. So I think that, if you're a journalist, I would say that it behooves you to, how many times am I going to say behoove on this thing? I got to find a different verb. We really all need to be better. We need more training on things like misinformation and disinformation and online abuse, and how to not, I think about the journalist Taylor Lorenz, who is often targeted, right, by some of, the most powerful people in tech, but also by conservative journalists, right? And if you're a person who isn't at Fox News and you're writing about that, that issue that day, maybe you're contributing to that pile-on, right? Because this was like a fake thing anyway. This was a manufactured kind of controversy. So I don't know that I really answered that question, but I think, we all have the capacity to understand the consequences of language, and we, all have the power to use language. And it doesn't have to be, like Soraya was saying, it doesn't have to be publicly. These are dangerous places. It doesn't always have to be in the street, on X. It can be at a dinner table. It can be a question that you ask in your research, right? There's so many ways to use language to mitigate harm. I hope that answers something.
I won't say behoove, but I think it's funny that you I just think that's it's a great word. Yeah, the first thing I thought was just a lot of what I do with language no one will ever see. So it's how I pitch a story to an editor. It's how I communicate to them what's important. No one will see that. It's the conversations I have with a source to sort of prepare them. Like, what happens when this thing gets published? Like, what happens if it blows up on Reddit? What happens if your abusive ex sees it? Like, so there's a lot sort of undergirding the public work that people get that, you know, if you are principled and you have the time to take to do it and the support of your newsroom leadership to do it, like most people won't even notice. In terms of what's public facing, this is just a long-standing issue that I still cringe. Every time I write the word she claimed or she alleged, or even sometimes she said, and I understand like why it's a tick and a go-to because legal, right? I mean, like if you have a story that for whatever reason your newsroom leadership, you know, doesn't stand on or is very scared about getting sued over, um, or like you just don't know. I mean, sometimes like you honestly just don't know. But I feel like in our culture, it just chips away at any story of sexual violence or sexual harassment that gets used around those words. Like most people don't understand like why that language is there. Like it is not me as a reporter saying, I don't believe this person. Not at all. Like maybe I don't, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about situations where like, you know, there are so many things that are expected of people who are coming forward about an experience of violence that they had. You know, I've in other newsrooms have had requests that people turn over dirty texts, which was just like, well, I'm glad you're telling me that. And you're not talking to the person in my story like that. Also like, you know, like there's just, I feel like this is one of those things that is just a convention that may be unfixable given the nature of the law. But it's something that I hate and I hate doing, and I try to find any other way around it. And the last thing is just sort of like not repeating those conservative frames, and I guess not repeating those like conspiracy theory driven, you know, whatever Ben Shapiro said the story was about Taylor Lorenz, not repeating what he says, you know, like finding a way to be honest about what's happening without advancing the misinformation that's coming with it is very challenging. But I think like you cannot work in this environment without learning how to do that well.
Thank you both. Yeah, and I can ask a couple more questions that I had if we have I think we have time for that or at least one more. But yeah, I wanted to ask, you know, since Election Day, I think we've seen some liberal politicians have blamed, you know, the outcome on supposed social issues like trans rights and abortion and argued Democrats should take more conservative positions to be successful. So, yeah, I wanted to ask what you all make of these arguments.
I think Soraya's face, you just need to look at her face. That's the counter. I'm not taking this one because I can't talk about policy, but
I mean,
Soraya,
I kind of just want to punt this to Melissa, but
Yeah, do you want to say something?
go, Melissa.
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I want to listen to Melissa first.
That was
That's
literally
what
my
I'm saying.
smartwatch going off telling me you have a heart rate abnormality happening. So thanks everyone.
Do you want to not talk and then I'll
No,
talk?
no, I do.
It behooves you to take care of your health,
Yes.
and I
It's
believe
true.
you should know.
No, I will talk about it. I mean, I was thinking about this like in the context of Gavin Newsom. I mean, there's so many of them, but let's start there. I'm former Californian, former San Franciscan. He was my mayor. um you know, the fact that not only is he sort of doing the let's throw trans people under the bus and let's throw immigrants under the bus too now apparently, but trying to kind of rebrand himself as like the guy who will like bro down with the bros of the right. That's terrifying to me, honestly, that that's like part of the calculus that he's making, like more than like the impact that his arguments of like we should throw these people under the bus, even also knowing that he's somebody who's sending burner phones to tech CEOs to have little private conversations with while he's like, let me invite my friend Steve Bannon onto my podcast. Like that's a horrible sign. And I think to the extent that we can stigmatize that and make it a problem is very important. And then I compare that with somebody like Senator Van Hollen, who I pretty sure was not a national figure at all until last week, when he was willing to go to El Salvador to check in on the health and welfare of one of his constituents who is imprisoned in CCOT. as far as we knew, and brought us back proof that he's alive. You know, I think there's like so much room for bravery right now. And when we have Democrats, ostensible liberals coming out and telling us that like all of our problems are because we stuck up for the wrong people, it's my response is just like, well, thank you for telling me who you're not willing to stick up for. Because now we know, and like we don't have to pretend. I also don't know that it's true. And I also have a really hard time framing the defense of human rights on, is this popular with voters? I think that's a dead end argument. And like, you know, it might also be true that like people have more support right now, for example, for immigrants' rights and are pushing back on what Trump is doing. But also if they didn't, it's still wrong. Like I don't like I feel like sort of like backed into a wall sometimes in media of just like, can we just say that? Like, why do we have to like premise this on like, you know, whose position is winning? But of course, you know, that's just me being idealistic, probably. But I try not to do it. I try not to cave into that. That is what these Democrats are banking on, is us sort of like framing their objection to stand up for people through the lens of, was this good politics or not? And we have to refuse that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is the kind of the center must hold thinking, and I'm just sort of like, why? It's not a good center, right? Like that's not the center we need. That's how we got into this shit show, right? So I mean, I think everyone here knows that trans people are being scapegoated, and that's what's happening, and they're suffering as a result of that. I do think, though, since this is a conference about male supremacy, I would love to hear anybody's thoughts about this. But, you know, when like on Trump's inauguration, when he made his announcement about the fact that in the United States, there are two, he used the word gender, right? He didn't say sex. He said gender, which he did, which was, I thought, interesting. But he said there are two genders, and immediately, for good reasons, people focused on trans issues. But I think what's difficult to explain to the average person who's not doing the things that people in this room are doing is that the only way male supremacy works is if you have that rigid gender binary. And anybody who crosses that line, non-binary people, trans people, gender non-conforming people in their appearance, any like non-heterosexual people, like it's just a domino, right? But the ordinal point is that you have to have the binary, and the binary is male, female in that case, or it's black, white if you're in that mode, or it's cis, trans, like it's always the binary, and it's always hierarchical. And so he just established that again as a structure of thought. And unfortunately, it's the structure of thought that most people are socialized in, right? This is most families are still hetero families that gender their lives, gender chores, gender children's clothes. Schools are factories of binary gender. Like you can just go down the list of all of the institutions. And so nobody really registered that on the level of supremacy that was male supremacy specifically, which then is woven. It is that connective tissue. That's where we started off when Melissa was talking. It's the connective tissue between all the others, right? Like you can't really have a black, white racial. I didn't grow up in this country. I've been here 40 years and I still don't get the black, white racial binary. Like it's like banging your head against a wall, right? Because it just doesn't make sense. But there it is, because it's this idea, and it's how the country was started, and unfortunately how the country's being unraveled. But I just think that getting people to understand how what they consider normal and moderate is already immersively supremacist in its structures. That's just where we are. And I'm just really happy to be menopausal, because now I have no problem saying it. I would have really struggled with that when I was like 25. So I'm very proud of the 25-year-olds I know who don't have any problem saying it, which is a feminist victory, by the way. Even in backlash, somehow an entire generation of people have really gotten it.
I just thought of one thing to add to that. I was wrestling with this earlier this week, actually, for a story about the pro-natalists and sort of
Mm-hmm.
this, swing towards allegedly pro-family or pro-mother politics. That's just more
Yeah.
patriarchy, and why are we pretending it's new?
Mm.
But the challenge that I had in writing about it is like, okay, some of the people advancing this stuff have other extremist beliefs.
Yeah.
Clearly, some of them are openly anti-Semitic, some of them are openly racist, some of them are really into eugenics and trying to repackage it, like obviously extremist beliefs, but also their beliefs about gender are extreme. They just happen to be normalized. And so can
That's right.
something be extreme and normalized? And that's sort of where I landed in the piece, is just like, this is kind of a mess, but the reason it's getting a pass right now is because it is still so core to
It's
how
so
this country is
core.
organized, and it isn't seen as extreme.
Right.
I guess the aesthetics of it, some of the outrageous things that they say are extreme, but like there is something fundamentally extreme about women should be in the home producing as many children as possible, no matter what they feel about that. And it's just, I feel like I'm sad that it's important to keep naming that. Like I wish that that's not where we were, but I'm feeling like it's more important right now, just to be very clear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I've grappled with that too. And the one thing that I have fallen back on saying that I think actually people like it's a good example is that so many women I encounter who are ardently fighting for abortion rights, for example, they will still go. I grew up Catholic. I'll use Catholicism. They'll still go into a Catholic church where women are ritually silenced, where they cannot have authority, like all the things about gender that are a problem broadly rippling through society, right? And there's just a disconnect because we think in silos. What, it's like Las Vegas. What happens in a place of worship doesn't leave the place of worship, which is bullshit. We all know that. But every time you take kids into a church like that, you teach them that men have authority, that women don't. And that's just a small little thing, right? It's just a little part of the equation. But I can see the lights go on because they're like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's what's happening. You don't have to say it to anybody. They're just learning it through osmosis. And then you end up with, 300 years and no women presidents or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have another audience question that I'll ask from Eliza Henry. Do you think asking women and other marginalized groups to protest within certain constraints, like staying cool, is a form of gaslighting? And also, what is the balance between advocating for ourselves without hearing the brunt or without bearing the brunt of the responsibility of educating others?
Can I ask for a clarification? Because I'm not sure what it means. The first question, to protest within certain constraints, i.e. staying cool. Can you clarify that, Eliza? Okay.
I can say something really brief on that, which is I think it kind of gets back to a little bit of that point about emotion regulation, like that I was trying to make earlier, like this is sort of what we're asked to do, is constantly sort of, like mitigate, right? Like really valid responses to really absurd, violent, like unjust conditions. And I guess, the politics of respectability is interesting because, it's different, right? For different women, right? Like so many of the women of color that I interviewed for the book were like, their relationship to that is so different. And so do I think it's a form of gaslighting? I mean, I think it's, I almost cursed. I think it's really I think it's messed up. I think this is the absurdity. This is the additional sort of challenge, the labor, the impossibility, right? Is to ask people to make these choices. And I don't even know if they're real choices, right? Like, who's to say that having, not staying cool isn't going to be effective? I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but these are the choices that we're constantly faced with, is managing our emotions while also trying to be responsive to these conditions that are that penalize us no matter what direction we kind of move in, right? I mean, it's my
I will say one thing about that. Like I did write a whole book about anger, not as a self-help book, but literally because of the way anger is used against women, particularly Black women in this country, as a legitimate expression of citizenship, right? Really and truly, pretty much only straight white men get to use anger as a political force without penalty, and in fact, with reward. And everyone else is either, like criminalized. An angry Black woman is very easily criminalized. An angry Black, I mean, President Obama had to have that. Remember the anger translator skit? Like that was funny, not funny, right? But I do think, and again, I'm going to go back to what Melissa said, the woman, Teresa, her last name, but
Borenthal. Yeah.
What happens with Black women is that immediately you can stay cool, you can practice respectability politics, and someone will still decide you're angry just because you woke up that morning. That's thing one. But thing two is that for white women, the go-to place is actually crazy, right? It's ableist. And not only is it that a white woman is crazy, but that in fact, anybody can be disabled in that way at any time. She was carted off because someone had decided to say that she had mental illness or like whatever the categorization was, And I also think that it was really interesting. I probably did what many people did, which is pore over the entire episode. Like I literally just watched the entire episode over and over again. And I will say that what I find interesting about this notion of respectability and tone policing and staying cool is that he referred to her as a little girl, right? And one of the big problems I think that is happening in particularly white evangelical and communities is that girls are not being compliant the way they used to. And in particularly young women, the gap between young men and young women is big, but it's not as big as the gap between young women and their fathers and grandfathers. And so the idea that little girls are not being respectable, that they're not being obedient, that they're not conforming and complying, I think is a particular worrisome thing, because that's how intergenerationally we pass along white supremacy. You have to have the women as socializers of white supremacy. And I think women not conforming, not staying cool, not Black women, but white women who are so tied down by those politics, which is a different conversation about respectability, I know. And as for educating others, most of the Black women I know and work with are pretty much tapped out, really not doing it and shouldn't be expected to, And so I don't know if any of that was relevant to the question.
Thank you guys so much. I'm just going to ask a closing question, and I think that will be time. But yeah, the last thing I wanted to ask was, since Election Day, there have been a lot of think pieces about disgruntled young men and the appeal of things like the manosphere, but far less attention paid to young women, girls, and queer and trans youth amid this large-scale rollback of their rights. What message would you give to them or to anyone trying to advocate for their rights in these uncertain times?
Just the fact that these think pieces are coming, at first I thought they were kind of like a do-over of like the Trump diner safari pieces of like, let's go check in with the injured man who also won. There's something also fundamentally weird about the manosphere that's like a fun topic for some people to write about without considering that it's actually like incredibly dangerous and damaging. So I can see how that sort of drives some of those stories, but it seems like what's really going on with those is the same thing. It is why people are being excluded from them who don't fit that, right? Like a story about like, why are these young men suffering that also ignores the disproportionate suffering and violence that women and queer and trans people and people of color are facing right now. Is this the story about the sad men is often a story about, well, how can these other people accommodate them? And so it's like a demand for conformity, or a demand to sort of like lower your standards, or don't ask so much, and if they misgender you, whatever, just go along with it. Or like if your partner's, you know, saying the R word, like whatever, just go along with it. Like I think that there's they're the disciplined people, and they're so out of proportion with reality. Like for somebody who, you know, is being ignored, like honestly, sometimes I think having your oppression ignored by the media is a great place to be, because you have room to move without the scrutiny and the bullshit. Um, on the other hand, like there's this larger sort of political project of saying what's happening to you doesn't really matter, right? And so it reinforces that. And I think it's it feels like a backlash also to like what little bits of progress there have been, particularly for young trans folks, but also for queer folks. It feels like a backlash to even Black Lives Matter. Like it just feels like, can't everybody just get back in line with how things were? You know, can't people just like go along? To the point now where like the most sort of far out there ones, like Curtis Yarvin, for example, are saying things like we need to repeal the 20th century. And so I see it also as sort of like a continuum of that argument. Like if you keep following that argument, you eventually get to, why do you have any demands at all? I mean, like I thought of this with the protest question. Like there's no way that people will ever satisfy people with their protests. Like there will always be somebody who thinks you're doing it wrong, because what you're actually doing is challenging power. So there's no way to win that sometimes. I feel like I'm honestly curious, like, is it more of the like Manosphere is interesting, Trump diner voter profile 2.0, disciplining other
I mean,
folks, or some combination?
don't you think I'm with the Women's Media Center, and we haven't done this in a couple of years for lots of reasons, but every year we do that annual audit of all media. And editors, particularly in political spheres, are overwhelmingly white, straight men still. And I think that there's a lot to be said for the fact that there's a certain level of identification and empathy. There are sons involved. It's very understandable. There's all the emotional protectionism I think you're describing. The right to comfort is implied in all of that. And I just think that relationship, the relationship between the structure of who's making these decisions, like the diner things, who's making the decisions, we can never let go of that. Right? It's the same in tech. Who's making those content moderation decisions? And yeah, I think it's the same old, same old. I personally really want people to start paying attention to the right-wing radicalization of women and girls, which is, we're still, I think, at an incipient stage of that, but that will happen really, really fast. You can, I mean, we already know what the signs are, what it looks like. But I don't think that will be as troubling to people in newsrooms, for example, as the fact that they finally went after tech because teenage girls had eating disorders, which is a horrible, horrible thing. I get it. But that is what they focused on for a reason. It wasn't that trans people were being like doxxed publicly all over the place, or it wasn't that Black women journalists were being stalked in their own neighborhoods. That's not what they chose. They chose something that probably resonated because a daughter maybe was sick, or, you know, it was just familiar. I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I'll make one point on what Soraya said, and then end with like the later part of that question, which is like the message, I guess, for people advocating. But yeah, I was actually, when you were talking, I was thinking about how, God, I don't remember even what year this was, but I don't know how many of us remember when like Betsy DeVos like invited like men's rights activists like into conversations about Title IX. And I was working on a story about men's rights activists and like just campus, like just a whole thing. And I spent weeks on it. And I remember being like, I think my daughter was really young at the time, and I couldn't be around her without her just, you know, trying to breastfeed. So I was like in my car, like on the street, like just trying to get this story done. And they killed it. They killed it because there was a white guy in the newsroom who was just in somebody's ear about it over and over, just, trying to legitimize really like their inclusion, right? Like this inclusion of these men's rights groups in this conversation. And I just, sometimes things happen. This leads into my last point. I mean, I think sometimes things happen and you're just still shocked, right? You're still shocked and disappointed. And I think that's good. Because I was thinking as I was like preparing to come on here that I had written, well, I'm going to get back to that. I'm going to get there. I had written a story back in 2017 about that was sort of like looking at the Women's March and comparing their sort of platform to the 1977 National Women's Conference, and sort of looking at how similar like the things that they were asking for were, just all these years later, still asking for sort of the same things, or demanding, I should say, demanding the same things, right? Equal pay, affordable childcare, humane treatment for immigrants, bodily autonomy, being able to live free of all forms of violence. And it was sort of surreal to kind of compare those things and to see that we were still, the demands were so similar. And I think you can read that as, I was thinking about Melissa's word, like she said something about being idealistic earlier, but like you can read that as like really, in a really cynical way, to just be like, oh my God, like we are still, the language is almost the same, right? In terms of what people are demanding. But I read it as, I kind of read it in a more sort of hopeful way, which is that we can sort of continue to kind of, I think we continue across like time and sort of over generations to continue to like pass down these like deeply held values, right? About like what human beings deserve. And for that story, I interviewed, I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who told me this, and I'm coming back to the shocked and disappointed thing. She told me this and I never forgot it. I keep thinking about it, which is she said that we need to continue to be shocked by things and to continue to be disappointed, and that in some ways that's going to be what sort of holds people to a commitment to kind of insist that women's lives matter, like even when it seems like they don't. And I don't know, I guess I want to, for me personally, like I'd like to, sort of end like with, like for myself, with just like that kind of attitude, that I just feel so honored to be here today with everybody in this spirit and to be so clear-eyed about what's going on. And I still do feel a great deal of hope.